Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Miriam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy.
Welcome to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we share stories of Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant. Today I'm talking to Wayne Johnson in the second part of a series on the origin of Lexington street names. Welcome to the podcast, Wayne.
Thanks, David.
So, in a recent episode, we talked about streets in Lexington that are named after horses, and today we're going to delve into other areas, including well-known subdivisions and other fun topics. So, Wayne, just to get started, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the subdivisions in Lexington, like Idlehour and Meadowthorpe.
Well, Idlehour has an interesting name-theme history. Of course, Idlehour Drive is named after Colonel E.R. Bradley's Idlehour Farm, which was formerly called Ash Grove. And so when Bradley purchased Ash Grove in 1910, his wife, Mrs. Bradley, said it was going to be a place of leisure, so they named it Idlehour. So Idlehour Drive is named after Bradley's Idlehour Farm, place of leisure. And that's the main road in that subdivision. It was built, I guess, the mid to late 50s, maybe, if I got my dates right. And the developer, William Blackerby, his family was Catholic. So he decided when he was going to name the streets out there, he would name them after his children, his wife, other family members, and put a saint in front of them because of the Catholic designation. So that's why you have streets like St. Margaret, who was a daughter of Blackerby, St. William, who was a son, St. James, also a son. He named St. Matilda after his wife, Matilda. Other streets out there, Coburn Boulevard's not a saint, but it was named after his daughter, Coburn. You got to wonder if there was why he didn't name that saint, but he named that after his daughter, Coburn. St. Anne was named after his sister-in-law. St. Philip was named after his grandson, Philip. St. Teresa was named for a cousin, Teresa. Wilfont Drive, named for his son, William Font Blackerby Jr. His full name, the developer, was William Font Blackerby Sr. So Wilfont Drive is a kind of an acronym of that. Is that the right word, acronym? St. Christopher, St. Michael. Interesting story I have about Idlehour is I grew up going to a Catholic school, so our school bus would go through Idlehour every morning, first grade through my sixth grade or whatever. And I always felt prepared whenever the school would have a quick quiz on saints, because if I couldn't name one, I'd just start naming the streets over there in Idlehour. Anyway, that was an interesting way of naming streets. And that's how that came about. We mentioned subdivisions. There's some other subdivisions out there that have some interesting name origins. Of course, everybody is familiar with Meadowthorpe. And Meadowthorpe Avenue, which is located off of Leestown Road, was named for a stock farm and mansion, which was owned by Jacob Hotstetter. And he built it in, I think, 1849 on the property. And the Meadowthorpe subdivision was created in 1949 by an act approved by the City Planning and Zoning Commission, and they decided to name one of the streets Meadowthorpe Avenue after the stock farm, Meadowthorpe. Some other streets out there, interesting names, Larch Lane. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with Larch Lane. I know my stepsons are because we used to have train club meetings there every fourth Friday of the month, and we would always say, we're going to Larch Lane tonight. Larch Lane was named for the numerous larch trees in the area. Another road out there is Pepper Road, so named for a Colonel James Pepper, who was the owner of a distillery in the Meadowthorpe area. Taylor Drive is also located out there, and it was named for the owner of the property at the time, Hugh Taylor. And that road opened in 1951. Here's an interesting one, Glendale Road. The developer, Hugh Taylor, named it in honor of the Glendale Cemetery in California. And now, why would he name it after a cemetery in California? Well, one of Taylor's favorite actors was the famed actor Wallace Berry.
Uh-huh.
And the very day that they were naming the street, Wallace Berry was buried in Glendale Road. So in honor of Wallace Berry, he named the street Glendale Road.
Oh, okay. And so I think we talked a little bit about this in your last interview, but how did you go about collecting a lot of this information?
My hobby is collecting old newspapers, especially local Lexington Herald, Lexington Leader newspapers. I got started in my collection on July 21st, 1969, because my mom bought some extra copies of the Herald Leader when man landed on the moon for the first time, and she gave each one of the kids a copy, and she said, "Here, save this. This will be, important one day." It's important even on that day. So that's the point I said, hey, this is pretty neat. So I really got into it in the early 80s, just collecting old newspapers, and I'd run across stories about how streets were named. And these things are not easy to compile because they're there's no book or no reference source. You just run across a newspaper article and, that's how that street was named. So I just started, whenever I look through old newspapers at home or here at the library on microfilm, if I see a story about a street name, I just copy it and compile it in my notebook.
And you mentioned newspaper articles, and one of the things that actually I learned from you working in the Kentucky room, when people come in and they're researching where their ancestor may have lived or their house in Lexington, there are lots of references in the paper. And I'm thinking specifically about an article in the Herald Leader that was all about the way street names have changed over time.
Yes.
And so, if we could talk about a couple of examples, for example, limestone.
Yeah, limestone, people wonder why limestone's called limestone. Well, the road leads to Maysville, and Maysville used to be called Limestone. And when Limestone was changed to Maysville, the street here remained Limestone. It used to be called, before Limestone, it used to be called Mulberry Street because of the mulberry trees. But it was basically named Limestone because it leads up to Limestone, I think the Limestone Creek or quarry or whatever up in Maysville. And they just kept the name. And that's how Limestone got its name.
Yeah, and are there any other street names you know about?
That changed?
Yeah.
Well, out here at Main Street, that wasn't always called Main Street. I think it was called, back in the pioneer days, Boone Station Road, a certain segment of it. Broadway used to be called Main Cross Road, I think it was.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and then High Street used to be called Hill Street because it's, goes up.
Not to change the subject too abruptly, but another area of the city that I was interested to learn about was an area you called Newspaper Row.
Yes.
Off South Limestone.
Newspaper Row is pretty interesting. I pass by there every day, coming in and going home. Newspaper Row is off Limestone Street, and it's basically right across the street from the UK Medical Center, that area, right before you get to Cooper. And some of those streets were named in honor of Lexington newspapers. For an example, Gazette Avenue was named in honor of the first newspaper in Kentucky, the Kentucky Gazette, which, by the way, we have the second copy here. Transcript Avenue was named in honor of the 19th century newspaper, the Lexington Transcript. Leader Avenue, for some of us old-time Lexingtonians, we remember the old Lexington Leader afternoon newspaper. It was named in honor of the Lexington Leader newspaper. The Leader was a daily afternoon paper from 1888 through 1982, and then it merged the Herald and became the Lexington Herald as we know it today. Press Avenue was named in honor of the Lexington's first daily newspaper, the Lexington Daily Press. That paper was founded in 1870, and in 1895 it merged with the Lexington Transcript, and that's what eventually became the Lexington Herald Morning paper. The newspaper row is very interesting because of the names, and like I said, we have the newspapers here on microfilm and some in bound volumes here in the Kentucky room. So if anybody out there listening wants to do some research And in old newspapers, the Kentucky Room is the place to go.
Definitely.
Now, a couple other streets out there. State Street, I know it's right near Newspaper Row, and I know it gets a lot of publicity during famous UK basketball or football wins. They like to burn couches over there, but State Street was named after the University of Kentucky. Used to be called State University.
Yeah, there's just so many connections that you don't know until you learn about some of these details, and it's really
I think about it every time I drive home, and you see Gazette Avenue staring you right in the face, and
I see Transcript Avenue all the time, and then I finally connected.
Yeah, you told me.
I was thinking College Transcript.
Yeah. Well, College Transcript is definitely something I do not want to talk about in this podcast. Another interesting street name theme was something that was created by a local developer. He's a former state legislator, and I call him Mr. Street Name. I've given him a designation as Mr. Street Name because he just had an interesting way of naming streets, and that's Ted Osborne. And he would develop a lot of areas out there on the south end of town, and he would name them after his children or family members, or he was a former Kiwanis Club member, and there's a bunch of streets out there on the south end that are named. If you ask somebody, well, who's this named after? Nobody would ever guess, but he named a bunch of streets after former Kiwanis Club international presidents. And I'll just give you a few examples here.
Sure.
Gladman Way was named after Kiwanis presidents of Madisonville, Kentucky, Maurice Gladman. Weber Road was named for Robert Weber of Grosse Pointe, Michigan. He was president in the late 60s. Irby Court, another Kiwanis president. I'll just read them off here real quick. They're pretty interesting. Forsyth Drive, Tally Road, Hamball Lane, Instad Court, McKittrick Court, Lansford Court, Summerhays Court, Solberg Lane, Pfeiffer Court, Moylan Lane. All of them are named after former Kiwanis Club presidents. I just think that's a really creative way for somebody to come up with names and to also honor people that he worked with. In my research, he would actually he'd take a picture of the street sign when the street was developed, and he would send the street sign picture to the person who was named after. And those people always got a big kick out of that because it's a pretty big honor having a street named after you, especially if you're not even from that hometown. All these folks are from outside Lexington. So Ted Osborne was a very creative name developer. Mm-hmm. And he also named some streets after his family members. Della Drive off Harrisburg Road was named after his first wife, Della, and that was developed, I think, in 1953. Zandale Drive, we all know where Zandale is. Well, that was named after his daughter, Zan.
Ah, okay.
And then Hollowan Road, those of us who know our Lexington Public Library history know that the former Southland branch used to be located on Hollowan Road. Well, that was named for his daughter, Holly Wynn. Lee Adams Lane was named for his son, Lee Adams. Sherrill Lane, also over there off Harrisburg Road near Della Drive, was named after his niece, Sherrill. Now, the one I can't quite find is there's a street right next to Sherrill Lane called Lynn Drive. And I said, Osborne had to name it after somebody named Lynn. And I've looked, and I haven't been able to find out who Lynn is.
Huh.
So I'm still searching.
Yeah, that would make sense that it was.
But those are just a few of the names. He developed a lot of properties out there on the south end. And he, like I said, I consider him Mr. Street Name because he just seemed to have fun with creating names for the streets. Because I know we mentioned in the last podcast that developers didn't like having to come up with names. Some of them dreaded having to come up with it. He seemed to have fun with it.
And then moving back closer to downtown, so there are a number of streets that are affiliated with Henry Clay.
Yes.
As well.
When people think of Ashland, nowadays they just think of that little area where the Ashland Estate is. Well, back when Henry Clay lived there was a big farm, and it really stretched out a long way. And so a lot of the streets over there on his former farmland were named in relation to Henry Clay's life or family members. For an example, Hart Road was named in honor of Clay's wife, her maiden name, Lucretia Hart Clay. Now, Shinaway Road, I think I mentioned this maybe in the last podcast. I can't remember. That's really how I got interested in compiling a list of street names. Is we had a caller here in the Kentucky room, more than 25 years ago.
Uh-huh.
How did Shinaway or Chino, he may have pronounced it Chino, I can't remember. How did Shinaway get its name? And I'm like, I don't know. So I'll research it for you and give you a call back. I think I had to call him back. So I researched it. I don't know how I found it, but that's how I got interested in compiling a list of street names. If not for anything else, as a possible reference source for when other people call and say, hey, what's this street named after? Because I've had people over the years ask, what's this named after? And it's not just streets. It's schools, buildings. I was talking to somebody, maybe last month about Jacobson Park. And, Jacobson Park is named after a former executive of the Lexington Water Company. Water company donated the land to Lexington, and I think it's E.O. or E.E. Jacobson. So it's interesting how these names come about, and people will ask about them.
Do they ever ask you what is the official pronunciation of Chinaway?
I think I've corrected, I'm the last one to be able to pronounce something correctly. But growing up here in Lexington, we've always known it as Shinaway.
Shinaway.
Again, my school bus went up Shinaway, up to Christ the King. So I always have known it as Shinaway. It's Shinaway. But you will have people pronounce it as, who aren't from Lexington, as Shino.
Uh-huh. I've heard all kinds of pronunciation.
I would go with Shinaway.
All right.
That's my official old-time Lexingtonian pronunciation.
We have it from Wayne Johnson.
Yeah.
That is.
Well, anyway, Shinaway Road was part of the old Clay farm, and it was named for his wife's Lucretia Clay's aunt, who was Shinaway Hart. Fincastle Road was named in honor of Fincastle, Virginia, which was a county where Kentucky County originated.
Yes.
Fincastle County used to include all of the present-day Kentucky. Chenault Road was named in honor of a Clay family name, Chenault. Ashwood Drive, Catawba Road, Sycamore were all named in honor of trees that were abundant on the Clay estate. Dow Road was named in honor of Major Henry McDowell and his wife, Ann Clay McDowell, and she was a granddaughter of Henry Clay. And McDowell actually purchased Ashland in 1882. So that's how you come up with the name McDowell. Richmond Road is the capital of Clay's home state, Virginia. So the name Richmond. And also it leads to Richmond. But I don't think Richmond, Kentucky was named after, I think it was named after Clay's Richmond, Virginia. I think it was named after Richmond, Virginia, but not because it was Clay's home state. It was another fella who was from that area. So I didn't get that far into the research. Clay Avenue near Woodland Park, named after Henry Clay. Ashland Avenue, named after the Ashland trees that were on the estate. Adair Road was named in honor of Clay's 1804 Senate opponent, John Adair. Can you imagine in today's political world somebody naming a street after their opponent?
No,
in politics?
I really can't.
No, it's not happening. I could think of some names they would come up with, but we won't go there. Prather Road was named after Henry Clay Jr.'s wife's maiden name, Julie Prather Clay. And of course, Hanover Avenue was named in honor of Clay's birthplace. He was born in Hanover County, Virginia. And then Slashes Road was named in honor of Clay's nickname as a kid. He was known as the mill boy of the Slashes.
I've always wondered about that one, where that came from. Yeah. So
that was his nickname, mill boy of the Slashes. Slashes was Clay's ancestral home, which was a marshy area in his home county of Hanover County. That's how Slashes got its name. So all those streets out there that were to honor the Henry Clay estate, the farm. It's pretty interesting.
You mentioned Richmond Road, but also like Harrodsburg Road, the implication is it's going the direction of Harrodsburg.
Harrodsburg.
Yeah.
And, of course, Harrodsburg, Kentucky was named after a pioneer. I think his name's James. I have it written down here somewhere. Used to have all this stuff memorized, but I'm getting older, so I gotta write myself notes. Harrodsburg, Kentucky was named after James Harrod, famous early pioneer. You mentioned Harrodsburg Road, a couple other big roads here in town, Tate's Creek Road. It was so named for the road's destination point where the Tate's Creek, there's a creek called Tate's Creek, enters the Kentucky River in Madison County. The creek at the river was named for a pioneer named Samuel Tate. And presumably this was a friend of Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone decided that he was going to name the creek Tate's Creek after his friend Samuel Tate. But Daniel Boone didn't name Tate's Creek Road. He wasn't around for that. But you have Nicholsville Road, which, of course, leads to Nicholsville. Well, it was named because it leads to Nicholsville, but Nicholsville, Kentucky is named after George Nicholas, who was an early Kentucky lawyer, judge, and he helped form the first Kentucky state constitution in 1792. So in honor of him, Nicholsville was named, and then, of course, Nicholsville Road is named for Nicholsville because it leads to Nicholsville. And another interesting street, Lane Allen Road. We're all familiar with Lane Allen Road. Well, it was formerly called Cove Springs Pike, and it was renamed in February of 1925, actually on February 21st, 1925, by the county court. Since the road passed the birthplace of famed Lexington novelist James Lane Allen, the county court decided to rename the street on the very day that James Lane Allen was buried, I think over here at the Lexington Cemetery, to honor James Lane Allen. Of course, you got Martin Luther King Boulevard. We didn't always have a Martin Luther King Boulevard in the early days. It was formerly Harrison Avenue and Walnut Street combination, and it was renamed in 1988 by the Lexington City Council to honor Dr. King. So we have Martin Luther King Boulevard as a result. Cooper Drive is an interesting story in my mind, at least. I always thought maybe Cooper Drive might have been named after the famed Kentucky Senator John Sherman Cooper.
Okay.
But it wasn't. It was named after a longtime dean of UK's agricultural school and also at one time an interim president of UK, Thomas Pole Cooper. That's who Cooper Drive is named after. Maxwell Street, you've heard of Maxwell Street? Named after the early Lexington pioneer John Maxwell.
And so with some of the downtown street names, do we know, where Upper Street, where that came from? Or
from my research, Upper Street was named as a result of you had the town branch going through the downtown area and go up the branch.
Okay.
That's where Upper Street got its name, is the branch was lower. And
then presumably Market led to the market.
Well, Market Street, as I understand, was named after the old market house that was in the Cheapside Park area. The early market house was in that area, and Market Street was named as a result. And, of course, Church Street, because I would assume the various churches. We have a fascinating
history.
Number of churches in that area, great architecture. And I don't get over there very often, but it's interesting area to walk. But Church Street, I'm assuming, got its name because of those churches. Patterson Street, we all know who Robert Patterson is, one of the founders of Lexington, Colonel Robert Patterson, and it was originally called Lower Street. And people were so accustomed to referring to that street as, well, it's a street that runs by Colonel Patterson's house. So somebody asked, what street's Colonel Patterson's house is. And so finally, they just decided they're going to just name the street Patterson Street because everybody went by there and said, oh, there's James Patterson's house. I mentioned earlier, Main Street used to be called Boone Station Road, and I think there's some other names there. Broadway was called Main Cross. I'm trying to think of. I'm sure there's a reason Vine Street is called Vine Street. I haven't quite run across the official designation of Vine Street. Somebody wrote a newspaper article years ago that referred to, I haven't seen any vines on Vine Street, so where did it get its name? And, we always point this out to people that are new to Lexington or not as old as, say, I am, is we would look out on Main Street and I would tell them, hey, Main Street used to be two-way. June 24th, 1971 was the changeover where Main Street became one way and Vine Street became one way headed east, Main Street headed west. And people are surprised to hear that Main Street used to be two-way, but I remember. I'm old enough to remember it.
Yeah.
And, to get outside the downtown area, just for a second here.
Sure.
Russell Cave Road has a very interesting name, and it was named in honor of Colonel William Henry Russell and a cave that was located on his property. And that area is famous for, this is where Cassius Clay had his famous fight with, I think, Samuel Brown, and invented the Mr. Potato Head in reverse maneuvers. It's a pretty famous fight. We referred to it in our Cassius Clay podcast a couple years ago, but that's where that fight took place.
So, clearly you have an encyclopedic knowledge. We could go on for hours. Are there any names that just really stand out to you that you want to talk about?
We talked about subdivisions earlier, and, some of these subdivisions have interesting naming themes, and I'll just run across some of those. Blueberry Hills subdivision out there on the south end of town off of Wilson Downing has a college and university naming theme. So you got streets out there called Yale Drive, Tulane Drive, Purdue Place, Vanderbilt Drive, Temple Drive, Stanford Drive, Dartmouth Drive, Harvard Drive. And I was thinking about it coming in today. It'd be interesting. They probably had some exciting conversations back in the day when children would tell their parents they're going over to friends or they would say, I'm going to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, are you? Okay. That's pretty exciting. Okay. Yeah. That's my bad joke for the, for the podcast. Twin Oaks subdivision has a naming theme, and it's off Pasadena, that area out there here between Harrodsburg Road and Nicholasville Road, Clays Mill Road. They have a Western City naming theme. So that's why you got streets out there called Yuma Court and Seattle Drive and Wichita Drive, Pasadena Drive, Portland Drive, Laramie Drive, Burbank Court, Phoenix Road. The developers decided to just have a naming theme of Western City names. The north end of town in the Eastland area, it used to be called, when it first originated in the early 60s, it was called the Dixie subdivision, but they've gotten away from that name for obvious reasons. But it has a Southern City naming theme, so that's why you have places like Raleigh Road and Charleston Drive and Augusta Drive, Gainesville Court, Tampa Court, Sarasota Court, Nashville Court. All southern cities. So a lot of those streets out there, Atlanta Drive, are named with the Southern City naming theme. Growing up here in Lexington, never even thought about it, but
right. Well, that's one of the things we were talking about last time. It's these details you don't always think about them. You just drive down these streets every day, and then at a certain point, you start to see these themes in the naming of the streets.
And just a few other subdivisions real quick. There's Clemens Heights out there off of Clays Mill Road, past Man of War. Can anybody guess what Clemens Heights is?
Is it Samuel?
Exactly.
Okay.
It was named in honor of Mark Twain's Samuel Clemens. Uh-huh. So you got streets out there, which I really like this street name here, Huckleberry Circle.
Uh-huh.
That's, after Huckleberry Finn. Sawyer Court, Twain Ridge Court. So some streets out there are named in honor of Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Garden Springs had a naming theme of plants, flowers, and trees out there in the Garden Side area. So that's why you have streets called T. Rose Drive, Dogwood Drive, Jasmine Drive, Sage Road. Garden Springs Drive got its name because there was apparently the subdivision was built in an area which consisted of a lot of streams. So you got Garden Springs. And then you got the Garden Side area, which had a Civil War battle theme for their names. Manassas Drive, Fredericksburg Road, Gettysburg Road, Antietam Road. So that's Vicksburg Road. Can't forget Vicksburg. And then further on over toward the Cardinal Valley area, you had a French city and an English city naming theme. So that's why you see streets like Davenport Drive, Deauville Drive, which, by the way, Deauville's, I think, is still one of the sister cities of Lexington. So there's a lot of French and
then, of course, in Hamburg, you have Tuscany with like Carducci and some Italian named streets.
Yeah. So just a few other things here, just a few other street names I find pretty interesting. I'll just run through them quickly here. Southland Drive. Everybody knows Southland Drive, but a lot of people don't know it was formerly called Southern U Pass Road. It was renamed Southland by the county court on June 23rd, 1956. Of course, in 1956, this was before the merger, so that far out, that would be considered the county, not the city, necessarily a city of Lexington. So that's why you have the county court doing the renaming of the street. But Southland Drive used to be called Southern U Pass. Apparently, some of the merchants out there, property owners, didn't want it to change the name to something like Southland. So Turkey Foot Road. We've all heard of Turkey Foot Road. Well, one of the developers out there was J.W. Davis. And while he was traveling through Kenton County, Kentucky one day, he saw a Turkey Foot Road in Kenton County. And he was developing that area. And he said, that's a good, catchy name. So he named Turkey Foot Road after that road in Kenton County. Clay's Mill Road, a lot of people might think it's named after Henry Clay, but it's actually named in honor of Marston Clay, who was the owner of a grist flour mill that was located at the end of where Clay's Mill Road ends now. And a lot of the roads like Parker's Mill and Huffman Mill, etc., were named because families by that name had mills in the area. So that's how they got its name. Lansdowne Drive. I always thought it was kind of interesting. Again, the developers, J.W. Davis and a man by the name of McEachin, they both developed the Lansdowne area. On a trip to Natchez, Mississippi, they saw the name Lansdowne on one of the old plantation farms down there. And when they named Lansdowne, I guess in the 50s, they said, that's a catchy name. For sports fans, Avenue of Champions, which is located on a section of Euclid Avenue between Rose Street and Limestone Street. It was renamed in April of 1951 in honor of UK's football and basketball championships. A person from Bardstown, Kentucky, Jerry Bean, suggested the name after New York City's Avenue of Americas.
Of the Americas.
Yeah. And he just thought it'd be a great way to honor the 1951 Sugar Bowl champion UK football team, which beat the number one Oklahoma team, had like a 47-game winning streak. And to this day, if you debate football in UK, I'll debate anybody on football. That victory is the greatest victory in UK football history, bar none. And then the basketball championship, UK won it in 1951. And anyway, that area of between Rose Street and Limestone is where the old Stallfield football stadium was, of course, Memorial Coliseum. So that was the area where the Avenue of Champions came from.
Your knowledge of Lexington streets is truly like an encyclopedia. So
well, it's just
it's really impressive.
It's not like I'm a genius. I just see a newspaper article, I copy it and I write it down in a book, and then when you decide you're going to have a podcast,
you're ready. Sure. But it leads me to thinking about the knowledge of these street name changes when people are doing research and they're looking in newspaper articles. If you're looking for the wrong name of the street, it's where this kind of information really does make a big difference in what you're looking for.
And also, I know both of y'all have worked at Kentucky Room, the 1901 street numbering changes in the downtown area. What was an address in 1900 would have been different the following year because they redid the numbers. So you'll have people coming into Kentucky Room looking for such and such Main Street, and you have to tell them, oh, by the way, It changed numbers in 1901. Our city directories, the 1901 city directory does a great job explaining the changeover and has the old number and the new number. That's a great source to use when you're helping people with that kind of research. There's also a few other street names I'll just mention here. Just interesting to me. Kramer Avenue. Do you know how Kramer Avenue?
I don't.
Okay.
Seinfeld. No.
Okay. I'm sure Kramer will get a street named after him eventually. But anyway, Kramer Avenue off of Richmond Road was named in honor of a man by the name of Fred Kramer, who was the president of the Lexington Brick Company. That whole area, Kenwick, was developed beginning in 1908, that time period. So Kramer Avenue was off there. Mintel Park is named after a couple famous or noted Frenchmen here in town, Franklin Augustus and Charlotte Mintel. And they opened up a dance school, boarding school for girls. And Mintel Park, which is off Richmond Road, is named after those two people. So there's quite a few. I could go on forever. Castee Avenue was named in honor of the former city and county school superintendent of the early 1900s, Maslin A. Cassidy. And, of course, Castee School was named after him also. I'm sure you can answer this one, David.
Okay.
If you can't, I'll be very disappointed. Lafayette Parkway.
Oh, yes.
Okay. You
Marquis
did
de Lafayette, yes.
Yes, you did that great podcast a few months ago when Lafayette came to visit. Well, of course, Lafayette Parkway, Lafayette Avenue is named in honor of the General Lafayette. It's impossible to cover them all in this podcast, and it's also impossible because I don't have all of them. I just compile them when I run across them.
But I think that's a great point. If you are interested in learning about your local history and your city, please come visit the Kentucky Room. We have staff like Wayne who are here. They'll help you research a topic, direct you to great resources to learn about your family history, the history of Lexington, history of Kentucky.
And there's many subdivisions and many streets that we haven't covered that we can probably tell you the origin of the name if you came in and or called and asked, and we could do some research for you.
Wayne, it's always fun talking to you. I learned so much every time, and we'll have to come up with some more topics to cover.
Okay. Yeah. And like I said, and you mentioned it too, Lexington has a great history, and the Kentucky Room is really the go-to source in my mind to research this. It's open to the public. It's your library.
And we have the staff who will help you with it too. That's the great thing about our collection.
Yeah. And a very knowledgeable staff. And, what these podcasts do also is it really helps our knowledge, researching this. I mean, even though I've researched this years ago, you forget about it. And then when you come up and say, hey, we're doing a podcast on the street name, I'll volunteer.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thanks, Wayne.
Oh, okay. Thanks, David.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Miriam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.